The bullet, of course, exerts the same force on the tissue. Now, as that A increases dramatically, as the bullet goes from its normally oriented position to a 90-degree position, the area that you see increases dramatically, and therefore the force increases dramatically. As a bullet deforms, it also increases its presented area, and therefore a deformed bullet will have a much higher drag than a non-deformed bullet. The greater the deformation, the greater the velocity, the greater the force, the more dramatic that explosive effect is.
How long from the time that the bullet entered President Kennedy's head did we have the skull fragment and I guess the brains or what have you coming out of his head? How much time from the time it entered the back of his head did we have that fragment?
Well, if you recall in the movies of the skull began to fragment while the bullet was still in passage. And so therefore you might say that the skull began to come apart almost immediately, within microseconds of the impact. And
That's
then
what I was
continued to fracture and move outward.
I was still concerned about the question I think my colleagues, Mr. Funtroy, along with Mr. Devine, mentioned earlier about the direction of the bullet and the movement of President Kennedy's head, and talking about the time from the bullet entering the back of his head and the fragments of his skull. How did he have the muscles in the neck or the back or the legs or what have you to give the reaction to the rear rather than going in the direction of the bullet, which would have been forward?
Okay, the direction that was imparted by the bullet going forward would have been overcome by the neuromuscular reaction in about 0.04 of a second, if we can believe what happened to the animal. Would be the same in the human being. 0.04 of a second is, I think, well between frames on the Zapruder film. So we wouldn't expect to see any forward motion of the head before we saw the violent backward movement caused by the neuromuscular reaction. In other words, there was very little time for him to move forward before he began to go backward.
Chairman, I don't have any further questions.
Time of the gentleman has expired. The gentleman from Indiana, Mr. Fithian.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Sturdivan, have you or haven't you viewed the pathological data pertaining to the entrance wound in Governor Connolly's back?
Yes, I did review the...
I wanted to clarify something here. Perhaps I misheard. I thought in the exchange with Congressman Fontroy, it was said that the hole was a round penetrating hole. And I thought that the information we had before the panel yesterday was that it was a sort of a horizontal, as though the bullet struck somewhat perpendicular to the back.
Okay, as I recall from reviewing the same material that the forensic pathologist reviewed, that the entry hole had been excised and destroyed by the surgeons at Parkland Memorial, but that a subsequent description of that hole was given, which, as I recall, was elliptical. And in attempting to make a drawing of the shape of that hole, the surgeon drew an ellipse on a piece of paper. The ellipse that was drawn measured 8 millimeters by 15 millimeters. However, I'm not sure that that indicated the size of the hole so much as the elliptical shape.
So is it your judgment then that the bullet had to have struck something else and was tumbling when it hit Governor Connolly?
If it indeed had the shape that was described, then it would have had to have been yawed, and having been yawed would have required that it strike something else before it struck the governor.
Thank you. Now, in your experiments with gelatin and other tissues, if the block is horizontal and the bullet is fired exactly on the horizontal plane, it seemed to me that in several experiments that you showed us, that the bullet, as it went into the gelatin, had an upward bend to it. Is that correct? Is that usual?
Yes, that happens universally. When the bullet begins to yaw, it develops a lift, like an aerodynamic lift on an airplane wing.
And it doesn't make any difference which way it's yawing when it enters?
It will move in the direction that it's yawing. If it yaws upwards, then it will tend to move upward. If it yaws down, then it will tend to move down.
So then it is pretty specifically related to the angle at which it entered the tissue.
Exactly so. Unfortunately, the entrance yaw is unpredictable as to direction, so that you really can't predict whether it's going to go upward or downward or to right or left.
I have one other question I'd like to raise, Mr. Sturdivan. When I think you used the term radial velocity builds up, as it did inside President Kennedy's skull, and you described very vividly that it was that force that caused the skull to blow away.
Right.
If that were the element in determining the motion of the head, what direction would the head have moved?
Okay, from looking at the exhibit, I think it's 313, it looks to me that the material from the president's head is moving upward and toward the observer, which would have been out the right side of his skull. Now, having relieved the pressure on that side and not having relieved the pressure on the other side would have pushed the president's head toward the left, toward his left.
And insofar as most of the missing skull fragments are forward, in the forward half of the skull, would that have tended to contribute at all to the backward motion of the head?
It is possible that there would have been enough momentum lost in a forward direction that the skull might have moved backwards, or at least not moved forward as rapidly as it would have otherwise. However, if you recall in the skull films, most of the momentum was to the side, causing the skull to have a reaction in the opposite direction. But each of the skulls did move forward in the direction that the bullet took.
But in those, the entry was considerably lower than in the actual case. Isn't this correct?
Yes, but the exit, which is the more important here, was approximately in the right place. That is, the fragments of the skull were moving out from essentially the same place. What you're getting at is, no, I cannot exclude the fact that the loss of momentum from the skull fragments leaving could have imparted a slight rearward motion.
Thank you.
But that motion would not have been as dramatic as we saw.
Could I have just one quick question, Mr. Chairman? Thank you. Isn't a dried skull harder than a living one?
On the contrary, it's not quite as hard.
Thank you.
Okay. Gentleman from Michigan, Sawyer.
Yes, witness, I mainly want to see if I've gotten the import of your, of what I consider to be the main thrust of your testimony. Do I understand correctly that the bullet striking the president's head would not have imparted any really perceptible motion in one direction or the other as far as the Zapruder film was concerned?
That is true, sir.
And that, I presume, is what was illustrated on the striking of the dead goat that was hanging in suspension, even though it went through the skull and lodged or hit the spine, that it didn't, at least I didn't perceive it moving. Was that the object of that test?
Yes, it was, sir. In fact, there was motion there, but it was so slow that it was not perceptible in the film.
And that was at a very high-speed film, too, I assume.
Well, it was 2,400 frames per second, approximately 100 times the normal framing rate for a camera.
And that the backward or stiffening back and so forth of the live goat, or the goat that was being killed by being shot in the head when it was alive,
Yes.
was due to that same muscular reaction of the back muscles that you talked about, as opposed to any force of the bullet.
Oh, yes, definitely, sir.
Now, one other point that I'd like to be sure that I have too, and that is that if we assume that the deforming or destruction or damaging speed of a bullet is, let's say, 1,100 feet per second or lower or higher, and a bullet strikes an object that deforms or destructs, let's say at a speed or an impact speed of 300 feet per second, that the bullet, as long as it's below its impact, its damage speed, it can destroy or shatter the object with the lower damage threshold and itself not sustain any measurable damage because it's below its destructor damage point. Do I understand that correctly?
That is exactly true, sir. That, I think, may explain the statement of Dr. Bodden yesterday when he said that he'd observed a great number of handgun bullets which had smashed bones and not been severely deformed themselves, because handgun bullets do typically strike around 1,000 feet per second or less, which, according to my crude calculations, is below the deformation point of a bullet, but certainly above the deformation point, the smashing point of a bone. So I think that's dramatic evidence that it is true. There is that effect.
And do you, in watching the Zapruder film where the president was struck in the back and through the throat as opposed to the second shot, you observed, I'm sure, that the president raised his hands to his throat at that point, which I presume would indicate that the spinal cord was clearly not severed, or he would not have been able to do that.
Right. If the spinal cord had been severed, then he would he might not even have exhibited any neuromuscular reaction that I explained before.
But certainly if it was severed that high, he would not have been able to raise his arms to the point of the wound, or even if it had been severely damaged. Thank you. That's all I have, Mr. Chairman.
Time, gentleman, has expired. Gentleman from Pennsylvania, Mr. Edgar.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I just have one question and then a comment that I'd like to make. Let's speculate for a moment that the three shots that left the right rear someplace, traveling in the direction of the car, that the first shot struck President Kennedy, causing him to clutch his throat and enter his back and come out his throat, and that the second bullet struck Mr. Connally directly, going through his chest cavity, striking his rib, hitting his wrist, lodging in his thigh, and that the third shot struck the president in the head, causing the massive wounds that have been described over the last couple of days. It's a different speculation than the one bullet theory. What in your area of expertise leads you to believe that that speculation could not be true?
Well, in fact, nothing within my area of expertise leads me to believe that that could not be true.
So that it is possible that the second shot that I'm speculating could have entered Governor Connally without passing through another person?
Well, the only evidence that we have is the description of the entry wound on Governor Connally as being elliptical, which indicates that that bullet hit something before it hit Governor Connally. Now, if it went through 10,000 leaves or a few small twigs that would be below the point where it would deform the bullet or deflect it to any considerable extent, it could have been yawed. So as far as I am concerned as an expert, I can only state that that bullet had been deformed before it hit Governor Connally if it caused an elliptical wound in his back, which has been described.
Would it not be elliptical if it entered at an angle?
Yes, but if you make some geometrical drawings, you'll find that in order for the ellipse to be roughly twice the diameter in one direction that it is in the other, it would had to have entered at an angle that was 60 degrees from the normal. In other words, if this is a normal entry wound, it would have had to have been tilted 60 degrees from that, or only 30 degrees up from parallel to the surface. Okay, a bullet entering at that angle would have had to have roughly turned a 60-degree angle upon entry in order to exit out the front of the governor. And bullets just don't make abrupt 60-degree angle turns. Consequently, I can conclude from that since the path was predominantly forward, that it was not an acute angle, but a yawed bullet that entered him.
Thank you. Just one final comment. I think that was unfortunate that you had not seen directly the physical evidence that we shared with you, the actual bullet that we've been discussing for most of the day. I do think, for the record, we should indicate that later today we will have before us 4 members of a panel who will be able to talk in more detail about ballistics and deal with a number of other factors relating to the bullet itself, and they have had the opportunity to see that bullet as well as the guns that were used in this event. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
One comment, if I may. No, I had not held the bullet in my hand before, but I had studied, of course, the photographs, and I had access to the amount of deformation and so forth, information on the amount of deformation.
Thank you.
Gentleman from Michigan, Sawyer.
Yes, I just want to clarify something. I think you may have used an inadvertent word that I wanted to be sure was either corrected or confirmed. You said for the bullet to enter in an elliptical or create an elliptical entry wound into the back of Governor Connolly, it would have had to have been deformed going through something before, whether it be the president's body or not. I don't know that you meant that. From your earlier testimony, I thought you said it would not deform going through soft tissue, but rather would yaw as opposed to being deformed. Am I correct on that?
I probably was speaking too fast. I intended to say that the bullet would have been undeformed, not deformed, but merely yawed by hitting something else.
All right, thank you. Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Chairman.
Time of gentleman has expired. Let me just ask 1 or 2 clarifying questions. You've just mentioned the fact that you were shown photographs of Exhibit CE 399. Is that correct?
Yes, sir, it was.
And asked for your opinion based upon a photograph? Were you asked for an opinion based upon the photograph?
Ask about an opinion with respect to the amount of deformation and so forth,
right,
based on photographs, yes.
Right.
Yes, sir.
So what you're saying here today is that you were consulted with reference to this particular missile?
Well, in interviewing by the staff, we did cover that point several times, yes, sir.
Okay. That was our staff you have reference to, the House Select
Yes.
Committee staff?
Yes, your staff, the staff of your committee.
Okay, thank you. Counsel for the committee, Mr. Matthews.
Mr. Chairman, can we put into the record JFK Exhibit F-117, which is the gelatin shot film, JFK Exhibit F-304, which is tomato juice shot film, JFK F-305, which is the skeleton experiments, and JFK F-309, which is a goat shoot film. And have that made part of the record, Mr. Chairman?
Without objection, they may be entered to record at this point. Mr. Sturdivan, as a witness before our committee, under our rules, you're entitled to 5 minutes. at the conclusion of your testimony for the purpose of explaining or amplifying or in any way expanding upon the testimony you've given this committee. On behalf of the committee, I at this time extend to you 5 minutes for that purpose.
Thank you, sir. I don't think that I have anything really to add to the testimony, to amplify or so forth. I should, however, mention the fact that I am not here as a representative of the U.S. Army, that the opinions that I represent here are my own, and although the Army has very graciously allowed me administrative leave to appear as an expert witness, I am not a representative of the Army. And I do wish to thank the members of the committee and the members of the staff, especially Mr. Matthews, for the help that they've given me and the support, particularly when the microphone failed, and for dragging me through the relatively unscathed. Thank you very much.
Thank you. You've been very helpful to the committee, and we appreciate the cooperation you have given the committee and the staff, and we appreciate having had your testimony here today. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
The chair will recess the hearings until 1:30 this afternoon. We'll reconvene at 1:30.